presenting Union Gospel Presses Sunday School Lesson number 10, Sunday, February 6, 2022. The lesson is entitled Trials and Denials. Lesson text comes from John chapter 18, verses 15 through 27. Related scriptures are Matthew 26, 59 through 75, Mark 14, 55 through 72, Luke 22, 55 through 71. The place is Jerusalem. The time is 30 A.D. It was the worst night of Jesus' life. How did he handle it? What did he do? To whom did he turn? On this night, everyone turned their backs on him while his enemies put in motion their plot to kill him. Jesus had no one to turn to. One of his disciples betrayed him, and the others abandoned him in Gethsemane. Mark 14:50. To make matters worse, one of his closest disciples would deny even knowing him before the night was over. We too sometimes face rejection from people, both friend and foe alike. When we are rejected by people, we can turn to Christ because he will never reject those who come to him in faith and love. We can know that he loves you no matter what kinds of situations you may go through or mistakes you have made. He will never leave you nor forsake you, Hebrews 13:5. And he is the friend that sticks closer than a brother, Proverbs 18:24. Today's aim, facts. To examine how Jesus is tried by the high priest while Peter denies knowing him. Principle. To recognize Christ's faithfulness in a situation where men were unfaithful. Application. To always turn to Christ when others turn away, knowing that he is always faithful. Illustrating the lesson. Christians are called to stand out for Christ, not try to blend in with the world. Practical points. 1. The Lord can use earthly connections to place us where he wants us. John 18:15 through 16. 2. A focus on our own comfort can keep us from testifying to others about our relationship with Jesus. Verses 17 through 18. 3. Integrity means doing and saying the right thing at all times. Verses 19 through 21. 4. Truthfulness is the best policy, but it is not always appreciated. Verse 22. 5. People who are out to destroy God's work will persist in their opposition. Verses 23 through 24. 6. Denying Jesus is another way of betraying him. Verses 25 through 27. Golden text. Jesus said, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Mark 14:62. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is Peter's first denial, John 18:15 through 18. The second is Jesus' first trial, John 18:19 through 24. And the third is Peter's further denials, John 18:25 through 27. Introduction. Many people have had the experience of being in court. They may have been there as defendants, plaintiffs, jurors, witnesses, or just as observers. Few of us qualify to be in court as attorneys or judges. Unlike television courtroom dramas, the wheels of justice grind slowly in a real courtroom. Nor are most cases as exciting as portrayed in fictional courtroom scenes. Between his arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane and his crucifixion, Christ endured 6 trials. Unlike under modern American justice, where a case can drag out over several months or even years, Jesus was tried and convicted within a matter of hours. Not being a Roman citizen meant he had no right of appeal or any legal representation. Peter's first denial, John 18:15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. Verse 16. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Verse 17. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. Verse 18. And the servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Trying to follow. John 18:15 through 16. When Jesus was seized in the garden, the disciples fled into the night. But true to his bold nature, though cautiously, Peter followed afar off. Luke 22:54. That is, at a distance to see what was going to happen. While we cannot be certain, most think that the reference to another disciple was to none other than the author of this gospel, the Apostle John. But some think it was another unnamed disciple. F. Bruce suggests that it was an unknown Jerusalem disciple who had access to high society. Whether it was an unnamed disciple or John, he was known to the high priest. We do not know what the connection was, but it did make it possible for Peter to be granted access to the courtyard of his residence. It is likely that the high priest and possibly other members of his family resided in or near the temple courts. In the time of Christ, the entire temple complex covered about 36 acres. It was only after the other disciples spoke to the woman who watched the gate to the courtyard that Peter was able to gain admission to the courtyard. As is still true, access to both people and places is often contingent on whom we know. We even refer to these people as gatekeepers. Standing in denial. John 18:17 through 18. As the woman led Peter into the courtyard, she asked him if he too was not one of Jesus' disciples. Exactly why she suspected this about Peter is unclear. Perhaps she thought she recognized him from a previous encounter, or she may have detected his Galatian accent. A.T. Robertson notes she made it easy for Peter to say no, in that her question to Peter is cast in the form expecting the answer no. Worth noting, too, is the fact that her question is formulated to cast disparagement against Jesus. You're not one of this man's disciples, are you? At this point, Peter swiftly denied that he was one of Jesus' disciples. He would eventually deny the Lord 3 times as foretold by Jesus in all 4 Gospels. Matthew 26:33 through 34, Mark 14:30, Luke 22:34, John 13:38. The night was cool, so those gathered had built a fire to keep warm. Being a fire of coals, John 18:18, it was not a blazing fire that people could easily be warmed by at a distance. Since a fire would require those present to gather closely together at its edges to keep themselves warm, Peter was likely trying to blend in with those present, and he therefore stood close to them. This decision would eventually set him up to again be challenged about knowing Jesus, leading to his further denials of him. Jesus' first trial, verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine, verse 20. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Verse 21. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me, what have I said unto them? Behold, they know what I said. Verse 22. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Verse 23. Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Verse 24. Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest. Interrogation and reply. John 18:19 through 21. Jesus' first hearing was before Annas, the former high priest and father-in-law of Caiaphas, the current high priest. The office of high priest was a lifetime position, and the Jews still considered it so, despite the fact that its term was now set by the Roman authorities. Annas was still considered by many Jews as the lawful high priest, so that is undoubtedly why Jesus was brought before him first. Before things could move ahead, Annas would have to give his stamp of approval on the proceedings. Annas questioned Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Since all rabbis had disciples, the high priest likely wanted to know where Jesus' followers were from and possibly why they had decided to follow him. He may also have wanted to know how many disciples Jesus had and what a revolutionary threat, if any, they might pose. Since the high priest had connections with the Roman authorities, it is likely that he wanted to ascertain whether Jesus and his disciples were a political threat to the Jewish religious hierarchy and their always tense relationship with Rome. This was Annas making a preliminary examination of Jesus, probably to see on what terms Jesus made disciples, whether as a mere rabbi or as Messiah. The high priest also questioned Jesus concerning his teaching. Since Christ had already had numerous confrontations with various religious leaders, especially the Pharisees, Annas was probably trying to decide whether his teachings were any threat to the Sadducees, the party to which he had many other priests belong. It seems clear, however, that the religious leaders, whatever party they were associated with, were bent on ridding themselves of Jesus. While the Pharisees and Sadducees could agree on little else, they did agree that Jesus should be done away with. In response to the high priest's inquiry about his teachings, Jesus boldly referred him to what he had taught openly in public places of worship, both in synagogues as well as in the Jerusalem temple. It was not as though Jesus had been running a covert operation. All he had taught and done had been in open public forums. Abusive treatment, John 18:22. Earlier in his ministry, Christ had said, "If I bear witness of myself, my witness is not true," 5:31. By this he meant that from an Old Testament legal standpoint, a person's testimony about himself does not verify any fact as true. Some objective collaborating testimony is required to establish a true fact. For example, if one person accuses another of a crime, but the accused person denies the charge, it is merely one person's word against another. Nothing has been legally proved. Additional collaborating testimony must be presented to establish that the accused is in fact guilty of that crime. The above being true, it was not irregular that Jesus would answer the high priest by referring him to those who had actually heard him teach. A considerable amount of disinformation about Jesus and his teachings were circulating in Jerusalem at this time. 7:12, 20, 40 through 43. He therefore told the high priest that he should consult those who had actually heard him on various occasions. At this, one of the officers of the high priest slapped Jesus across the face with the palm of his hand. The Lord's indirect answer to the high priest was seen as insubordination and disrespect. This was just the beginning of the abuse Jesus would endure at the hands of both the Jewish and the Roman authorities throughout his trial and execution. Honest challenge. John 18:23. In response to this abuse, Jesus answered his attacker to give a valid reason for the attack. Since Jesus had said nothing evil and had meant no disrespect to the office of the high priest, why had the officer struck him? In a prior confrontation with the Pharisees, Jesus had challenged them by saying, "Which of you accuses me of sin?" And if I say the truth, why do ye not believe me? John 8:46. Christ was innocent of all wrongdoing, and the officer's reaction was unwarranted. This was just one of many violations of the law that occurred during the trials of Jesus. According to attorney Earl Wingo, there were 15 obvious violations of Jewish and Roman law in the proceedings against Jesus. Abrupt dismissal, John 18:24. At this point, Annas had apparently heard enough. He sent Jesus to the current high priest, his son-in-law, Caiaphas. As a final note concerning the term high priest, it is used not only of the presiding high priest, but of others who were leaders in the Jewish religious hierarchy. Hence, when it is used of one person, it is rendered high priest, John 18:10, 13, 15, and 16. But when more than one priest is indicated, it is translated chief priest. 7:32, 11:47, 18:35, 19:6. This is true in all four Gospels. Concerning Jesus' trial before Caiaphas, the other Gospels give considerable detail. Matthew 26, 57 through 68, Mark 14, 53 through 65, Luke 22, 54 through 71. These other accounts also include the fact that the Jewish Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, condemned Jesus. Since not all members of the Sanhedrin had to be present to conduct business, it may have been a hand-picked group that would simply rubber stamp the wishes of Annas and Caiaphas. There were, however, a few dissenters to this actions. Luke 23, 50 through 53, John 19, 38 through 42. Peter's further denials, verse 25. And Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, Art not thou also one of these disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. Verse 26. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, Did not I see thee in the garden with him? Verse 27. Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. Denial 2, John 18:25. Meanwhile, Simon Peter was still warming himself at the fire along with some servants and soldiers. Someone asked him, Art not thou also one of his disciples? As he had done previously, Peter denied Jesus by asserting, I am not. This was the second time since Jesus' arrest that Peter had denied him publicly. Peter had pledged his loyalty to Jesus, even if it meant his own death. But when he was actually faced with owning his loyalty to Christ before those who could have him arrested and punished along with his master, his courage failed. When push came to shove, he lied to save his own skin. There is a humbling lesson for everyone who relies on his own self-confidence in the Christian life. In 1 Corinthians 10:12, Paul warns us, Let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. It is only through the grace and power of the Holy Spirit that we can persevere in our faithfulness to Christ. Resisting such temptation is not easy, but the Peter we see here is a stark contrast to the Peter we see in Acts 2:14 through 40. After the Holy Spirit had come to dwell in the church and in the hearts of every believer, Peter was emboldened to stand up and intrepidly proclaim the gospel in the very heart of Jerusalem. His preaching pierced the hearts of his listeners, compelling them to beg him to tell them what they needed to do to be saved. Even after the most dismal failure, there is yet hope of great victory if we endure in faith and reliance in God's grace. Denial 3, John 18:26 through 27. One of the servants standing near the fire with Peter just happened to be related to Malchus, who had his ear cut off by Peter. This servant had also been present in the garden when Jesus was arrested. But since it had been dark and there had been a large number of people there, he was apparently not completely certain that Peter was actually the one who had attacked Malchus. He nevertheless was suspicious, so he asked Peter pointedly, "Did not I see thee in the garden with Jesus?" Upon this third denial, the rooster immediately crowed. Comparing the four accounts of Jesus' denial of Christ provides additional details concerning this episode. They are all similar but different enough to conclude that there was no collaboration between the four evangelists. Of note is the fact that Peter actually backed up his denials with cursing and swearing, Matthew 26:72, Mark 14:71. Those present also recognized him as a Galilean because of his accent, which differed from those from Judea. Matthew 26:73, Mark 14:70, Luke 22:59. Luke also mentions that Jesus looked upon Peter at this very moment, 22:61, probably as he was being moved from the residence of Annas to that of Caiaphas. Upon remembering what Christ said, Peter went out and wept bitterly, verse 62. Most believers can remember times when they have in some manner denied knowing Jesus. The world is hostile to the claims of Christ and likewise hostile to those who follow him. This hostility is often expressed by contempt for those who publicly dare to express allegiance to Christ. It can be observed at times when a Christian sports figure gives praise and thanks to Jesus Christ for his or her success. The interviewer seldom acknowledges what has just been said, urgently endeavoring instead to change the subject. Talking about Jesus invariably makes worldly people uncomfortable. Sometimes it makes them upset or even angry and belligerent. We must therefore be very vigilant concerning temptations to deny Christ that are continually before us in the world. 1 Corinthians 10:12-13. Concerning Satan's tricks, Paul declares we are not ignorant of his devices. 2 Corinthians 2:11. But bold reliance on the power of the Holy Spirit who dwells in us will give us courage to represent Christ as faithful ambassadors. As John wrote to the readers of his first epistle, "Ye are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world." 4:4. Questions. 1. Which disciples followed Jesus after his arrest? 2. How did those disciples gain entrance to the high priest's house? 3. Who first challenged Peter about whether he was Jesus' disciple? 4. What did Peter do that set him up for his subsequent denials of Jesus? 5. Who first questioned Jesus after his arrest? 6. What two things was Jesus questioned about? 7. How did Jesus respond to the question about his teachings? 8. Why did the officer slap Jesus across the face? 9. Where was Jesus sent next? 10. Who challenged Peter about Jesus the third time? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, February 6, 2022. Thank you for listening. God bless.